You're listening to Bloomberg Businessweek with Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
Well, our next guest is an author of many books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Wizard of Lies, Bernie Madoff and the Death of Trust. That book made into an HBO film. It starred Robert De Niro and Michelle Pfeiffer. She also spent more than 20 years at the New York Times, where she was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize.
Can I tell you, Robert De Niro, for years leading up to with Tribeca, kept asking him, when are you going to do Madoff? When are you going to do Madoff?
And then he did it.
And then he did it. Anyway, go ahead.
She got him to do Madoff.
She did.
Her most recent book is Taming the Street, The Old Guard, The New Deal, and FDR's Fight to Regulate Capitalism. It came out last week. It's an exploration of financial regulation during the New Deal, a period of time that included the creation of the SEC. The Financial Times called the book, quote, riveting and timely, and I've got to agree. We're very pleased to have with us Diana B. Henriques here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Full disclosure, Diana did give me my first job in business journalism when I was a research assistant on The Wizard of Lies back in graduate school. Diana, welcome. It's good to see you.
He adores you.
Thank
Can
you.
I just say?
Thank you, Tim. You've turned out pretty well. I think my judgment was pretty great.
Well, thanks so much. So Carol and I were talking about this just in the last 3 hours, basically. Like everything we see today reminds us of the Roaring '20s and what was happening.
Isn't it remarkable?
It is
it's
remarkable.
Like deja vu all over again, as the old joke does. But, these are our Roaring '20s. And the press to deregulate, to reduce the fetters on unfettered capitalism, some of the arguments that I see in the press today were lifted from Calvin Coolidge almost word for word, comma for comma. It's amazing how the arguments, the defenses against regulation that emerged in the 20s and 30s have resurfaced today.
But it's not just the arguments against regulation. It's also the concentration of wealth that we're seeing right now.
That's what I thought was striking.
Concentration of wealth, the disparity of wealth, the amount of income growth that is going to the top 1%, the stagnation of average and ordinary workers' incomes, all of that is straight out of the 1920s. We're seeing technologies disrupting major industries, same in the 1920s. Major changes in manufacturing wiped out 3 million jobs at the beginning of the 20s, and 1 million of them never came back. So,
Diana, does it make you, because it's interesting, because we just talked a lot about AI today and the disruption there. Again, I mean, it's kind of a constant narrative. But does it make you say, listen, the world, the economy, the market, business, it's cyclical. We go through these changes. Or does it, I don't know, how do you think about it?
I think the market is always going to be a very sensitive barometer of a disruptive change. And whether that disruptive change is radio, as it was in the 1920s, which was, changing the way newspapers operated, changing the whole landscape of mass communication, or whether it's AI, arriving at a time when finance is already highly automated. But the reliance of the market on the status quo, considering that it makes its money because things change, right? It is amazing to me that everyone thinks it's going to stay the same. And indeed they did in 1928, 29, right up until October of 1929. They said, this is a perfect world. And for the plutocrats it was a perfect world, and it's always going to change. And within the next decade, as I detail in that's the stretch of time I cover in Taming the Street, 1929 to 1939, the world turned upside down.
Can I ask how you got there? Like, how did you say, you obviously could write about probably anything and everything. So what is it that said, I got to do this?
Oh, I fell in love with the story of Richard Whitney, the fall of the great New York Stock Exchange president. When I first started covering Wall Street, back in the Pleistocene era.
Stop.
And I said, gosh, what a tale. And it had been included in a kind of episodic, anecdotal book called Once in Golconda by John Brooks, which I loved. And I tucked it away, and always thought that period of creation of market regulation would have been fascinating to live through. But what really piqued my interest, Carolyn, was the 2008 meltdown. I was going to work at the New York Times every day in the fall of 2008 after Lehman Brothers closed, wondering if that would be the day the ATMs went dark. And I was aware as an amateur financial historian that I was living through history.
Right.
I was living through events that would be historic in the financial history of the country. And I said, people going through 1929 felt this way. What an incredible experience they had. So, but that kind of began to crystallize what I wanted to do. Then, of course, Bernie Madoff happened in 2008, and my life went off in a different path. And then the 30th anniversary of the 1987 crash came. Well, that got me closer to 29, because, of course, the 87 crash was the worst day in Wall Street history, eclipsing the worst days of 1929. And finally, when that book was done, I said, I think it's time. So I started work on this book about 5 years ago when no one ever mentioned the New Deal, when it was as if Roosevelt had never existed. But I'm digging into the story and seeing more and more parallels. And then as the last 5 years have unfolded, it is as if the puzzle pieces that matched the 1920s and 30s just dropped into place.
It's pretty shocking.
It was amazing.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the political environment here in which FDR came into office, because you note in the book that it's, quote, alarming political discontent erupting from the extreme left and the radical right. I thought to myself when I read that,
Sounds familiar.
are you talking about 2021? Are you talking about 2020?
No, I'm talking about 1928, 29, 30, 31, 32. The right, the suffering in this country, first, we can't even take it in today, but 25% of the workforce was out of work. In those days, that was 13 million people. But imagine that 1 out of every 4 people you know doesn't have a job. Many of them haven't had a job in years. People are living in caves in Central Park. They're scavenging landfills. The degree of suffering in the country is reaching such a point that it's a powder keg waiting to explode. From the left, you have increasingly militant communist interests that are eager to harness this worker anger and outrage to make gains in the political system. And that, of course, alarms the industrialists and captains of capitalism on the right, who are fearful of labor uniting with communists, and they start looking longingly at Italy and Germany, which have been under fascist control in Italy's case for more than a decade, and they say, they've got some pretty good ideas over there. Look how they're getting their economy going. Look how they're managing their labor unions, locking them up.
Right.
But so you've got these two tensions, and you've got a man who steps in, FDR, and says, if democracy can't fix this, people are going to give up on democracy. And so this is one last chance for democracy to relieve this suffering and give people hope. And that's what carried him into office.
The ties between capitalism and democracy. Like, it's tortured. It's important, right?
It's actually so simple as FDR saw it. And I didn't see it this way until I read speeches of his. When he signed the bill creating the SEC, he said,
wait, say that again. The bill creating the SEC.
Yeah.
An institution we take for granted.
Yeah. And we take the FDIC for granted. That didn't exist before Roosevelt. I mean,
So much.
We have lived our entire lives
Hello,
under the
regional
protection.
banking crisis.
Right.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So he saw that a healthy democracy required well-regulated markets that seemed fair.
Yeah.
He believed that if the average American didn't feel he could get a fair shake in the economy, he would not support the democracy. And so to him, the two were completely wedded. And so if I say, a lot of people are saying, democracy's on the ballot in 2024. I'm saying, yeah, financial regulation is on the ballot in 2024 too, because they are inextricably linked. The fairness of the economy in the eyes of the average American is what sustains support for this democratic experiment. And Roosevelt saw that almost break. Wow. There's a anecdote which I love. It's perhaps apocryphal, but I love it anyway. A visitor to the White House right after Roosevelt was sworn in at the depths of the Depression.
Right.
Said, well, if you can cure this depression, Mr. President, you'll be our greatest president. But if you fail, you'll be our worst president. And Roosevelt corrected him. He said, no, if I fail, I'll be our last president. Yeah. To the perspective of the people at the time, it was that desperate.
Diana, you devote an entire chapter in this book to the deregulation, or regulation, I should say, of private power companies.
Yeah.
And if we're still thinking about the parallels between the 1920s and 1930s and now, who are the private power companies of today?
Silicon Valley. The giant technology companies are the equivalent, the exact equivalent. The people who controlled electric power in the 19-teens and 1920s controlled the future. They determined where industry could flourish because cheap power would be there, where industry couldn't. They determined whether a farmer could flick a switch and turn on a light or had to light an oil lamp. They had total control over the electrification of the American economy. FDR saw how much power they had, and he said, too much, too much. This power was becoming concentrated in a handful of giant holding companies that owned everything, that were these Byzantine constructions, extremely fragile, and after the 29 crash, extremely hazardous to investors. And he was determined, even as governor of New York, he targeted utility companies as an area that needed to be regulated in the public interest. And when he came into the White House, he said, it's time. If we are going to have the electric century, if we are going to have this incredibly transformative technology reach across our country, it's going to have to be with government oversight, government supervision. And he spent a great deal of political capital to pass the Public Utility Holding Company Act, one of the most transformative pieces of legislation he enacted. But he felt it was worth it. And the results were that the American power system was far less oligarchic than developed nations in Europe and in the Far East. Consumers pay lower prices. They got service where they hadn't been able to get service before. It would be an interesting thought experiment to dial back and say, oh, too bad Roosevelt didn't get the Public Utility Holding Company Act passed. Congress was able to hold him back on the utility industry, fought him tooth and nail, fought it all the way to the Supreme Court. Let's imagine they won. They won. And so they continued to buy up local power companies and decide where it was profitable to sell power and where it wasn't profitable. And so that would have been the world that we would have had today. So they were, today's equivalent are the technology companies, those controlling artificial intelligence.
So do we need a lot more oversight of all of them?
I think we do. But I think more than just say we need more oversight.
Or regulations.
We need to modernize our regulatory system for the day we have today, just as Roosevelt designed his regulatory ideal for the market that he had then. Our system over the years has become fragmented, balkanized. It's weak, it's rusty, it's underfunded, it's underrespected, and it needs an overhaul, a top to bottom overhaul, to give it the resources and the brain power to tackle what needs to be regulated today. And like we can start with cryptocurrency and move all the way through to AI. The idea that business can just be unleashed to pursue its profit and somehow the rest of us will benefit.
I want to forgive.
Yeah, go.
There's so much money that shapes policy or regulation or lack thereof today. How does that have to go away before we make some progress in this area?
Well, I hope not. It's certainly people who look back at the Depression, and there are some economic historians who say, look, that was an exceptional period. We'll never have that again. The devastation of the Depression made it possible for Roosevelt to do things that no future American president will ever be able to do. I'm not a pessimist about that. I don't think we have to have 25% of our workforce out of work before people wake up to the fact that the way capitalism is operating today isn't benefiting the average American in the ways that it should.
But I mean, like money in politics that shapes policy.
There was money in politics in the 1920s. Actually, there was not quite apocryphal story that businessmen knew how much it cost to buy a U.S. senator. I mean, the prices were passed around. Money has dominated politics for a long, long time. But a charismatic leader who can go over the heads of the money and talk to the people can effect an extraordinary change.
Is Joe Biden it? Is Donald Trump it?
Well, both of them have a gift for communicating the simplicity of their ideas. Trump has made it clear that he is opposed to regulation. He bragged in his State of the Union in 2018 that his administration had eliminated more regulations than any administration in history. Well, even allowing for Trumpian hyperbole, that was close to true. Right. He has made it clear that if he is in office again, we will continue to see the dismantling of the regulatory regime that we've all kind of taken for granted. I wish I could see Joe Biden more outspokenly defending that regulatory machinery and laying out a plan for modernizing it and making it more responsive to today's crushing issues. But he certainly got the right policies in place.
Regulation, though, in this day and age is a bad word for politicians. Just have a minute left.
I know, but deregulating finance is like deregulating traffic. Take down all the stop signs, take down all the speed limits, eliminate all the insurance requirements, and who's going to be left on the street? Yeah. The tanks of the giant behemoths and the reckless little hot rods that are going to be whipping around. There's no room on that street for you and me. So don't deregulate markets.
I feel like I want another hour with you. Democracy, capitalism, they can survive together? Just got about 25 seconds.
Yes, I think they can. In fact, I think democratic capitalism has been proven to be the best way to improve the quality of life for ordinary people. But it won't do it without smart oversight by the people who lead us, and we have to elect those people.
Come back.
Diana B. Henriques, the author of Taming the Street, The Old Guard, The New Deal, and FDR's Fight to Regulate American Capitalism. The book is out now, and this is Bloomberg Businessweek.